What a great honor to be on this, be able to moderate this panel. And I was trying to think of the right way to start, and I found a quote from Al Gore in 1992. So you can make your own judgments about that choice. He said in 1992, focusing on adaptation represented a kind of laziness, an arrogant faith in our ability to react in time to save our skins. Now, what I find kind of interesting about that quote is now adaptation is part of the climate conversation. It's embedded in the woodwork. Everyone understands that there has to be adaptation. At the Institute, we have a whole initiative on trying to understand what it means, identify successful ways to do it. And it, of course, made me wonder, will there be a quote like that when it comes to climate systems engineering that looks very out of date in the not too distant future? And it also reminded me that change, it's often very surprising about how slow change can be, and equally surprising how fast it can happen once it comes. And so I feel like we might be at the precipice of this with climate systems engineering, and I wanted to, seed our discussion with that. I also want to say and appreciate David Keith's terrific remarks at the outset of what an awesome topic this is for a university. That is not the topic of this panel, but you have engineering, you have geosciences, you have political science, you have humanities, you have law, and of course, throughout that, the thread through that, of course, is economics. And I can hardly think of like a more interesting topic that requires insight and expertise from all those perspectives. So that's like on the academic side. But what's great and why I'm so honored to be here today is we have actual people who are participating in the real world as it relates to climate systems engineering. And so since I think either David or President Alvisado said that, which is correct, that we invented the phrase climate systems engineering here at the university, I thought I would just begin by asking our excellent panelists what they think is climate systems engineering and what animates their activities in that area. And I'd be happy to start with whoever wants to venture into that undefined space first.
So, why did I accept this job of chairing this climate overshoot commission, whereas I'm not an engineer? I knew absolutely nothing about solar radiation modification or cloud brightening. And the simple answer is I accepted to do that, because I'm one of the founders of this Paris Peace Forum, the purpose of which is to explore the frontiers of global governance today and tomorrow, where we know we will need global governance, but we have none. And the second reason, to be very frank, is that I'm going to turn 80 next year. And that's the real reason. And that's the reason why my grandchildren push me to do that. So we did it. I composed this commission with a bunch of old monkeys like myself and younger monkeys like Hina. I couldn't get a majority of young monkeys. I'm told that wise people are usually older. I'm not totally sure that is true, but that's conventional wisdom. But I succeeded in composing it, in putting a majority of people coming from the South, which was intentional. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And what we did, and the mandate we have, was to re-look in terms of global governance at cutting emission, adaptation, carbon removal, and opening this Pandora box of geoengineering, which we did. it clearly was the most difficult part of our deliberations during 2 years. We had very strong disagreements on this at the beginning. And I had a hard time keeping this group together, and Hina will remember that. And I want to thank her here because she did a lot to help me moving this forward. And what we landed was, as far as geoengineering is concerned, I leave aside the other emission cutting, adaptation, carbon removal, which were not the real point of attention of our report. We landed in a double recommendation. A, invest in science, and B, adopt a moratorium for in case of dangerous deployment. That was the balance, and it was a balance. And this is what we've been trying to push since then, and then was 18 months ago. In one, pushing for opening more investment, whether government, mostly government, or even private money and philanthropic money, into financing serious research, like the one that is done here. And second, try and create a sort of core group of countries, let's say 5, 6, 7 countries, who together would declare that they are adopting this moratorium with precise conditions, not on entering the moratorium, which is an easy thing to do, but precise conditions of how you exit the moratorium, which is a much more complex thing. And so far, we've been, let's say, reasonably successful on the first recommendation, a bit less on the second for reasons I can explain as necessary.
Thank you. Manish, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of environmental organizations. And I think I would say probably the history of their embrace of climate systems engineering, you should define it how you want, has not always been so embracing. And it seems like something is beginning to change. I wondered if you could talk about that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you did not ask me to define. I did study engineering and economics and climate, but I still would struggle to answer your question. But let me tell you a little bit. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and we are starting to engage both on CDR and SRM in a more serious way. And I think the thing that really has changed over the past 10 years is the science, is kind of where we are in the climate fight today, right? We know the IPCC, if you go back 2030, we're supposed to be 40 to 50% below 1990 emissions in 4 short years. Where are we today? Like, who here knows where emissions are today relative to 1990, right? We're supposed to be half below. We're about a half above. That gap between where we should be and where we are is, in my mind, the defining challenge of this decade. And that has, I think, forced us to recognize that it can't just be mitigation or mitigation and adaptation. We have a framework. It is about mitigation. It is about adaptation, but it has to be also about CDR. And the earlier speakers spoke eloquently about the scale of CDR that we need, but we also have to explore SRM in some extreme scenarios. And so that's very consistent, I think, with the Overshoot Commission's kind of CARE agenda, but that point that we need to look at all 4 and recognize it's not a moral hazard, we need to do all of them, is critically important. And at least for environmental organizations like mine, even though the vast majority of our work, 70%, is still mitigation, we have now a serious effort around building resilience. And I'd say 5% of our resources go into CDR and SRM, just to give a little bit of the scale of the shift that's starting to be made in organizations like that.
And could you, I know this shift at NRDC is really noteworthy. I don't, Manish deserves a lot of credit for it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, give some flavor of how it was possible to get from this is a verboten topic to, I guess, it is now a central part. Maybe not where most resources are devoted.
Right. But incredibly important, because I think to get either CDR, SRM in play at scale, we're going to need policy, public policy. And so getting organizations that help shape policy is going to be incredibly important. I should say our position on SRM is exclusively focused on research and governance. We do not support deployment, at least not at this time. But the reason why is because I think that we are in a non-zero, a situation where there are a couple of non-zero scenarios. How do you avoid really risky deployment of SRM? And on the other extreme, we might be in a break glass scenario where we're starting to approach tipping points and we're going to need to do something quickly. If we haven't done the research, haven't figured out the governance before, we could end up in a very suboptimal place. So it's those extreme scenarios that are non-zero today that require us to intentionally be thoughtful about how we look at research, how we look at governance of some of these new topics.
Thanks. So I was very disappointed in McCall's introduction of Hina. Hina, McCall covered many of Hina's accomplishments, but I think did not cover the one we hold dearest at the University of Chicago, which is Professor Khar, who she co-taught a course this fall for us, which was a major success. So, Hina, I wanted to ask you if you could, I think most people in this room have not spent summer in Pakistan. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like. I mean, I've seen pictures of melting cement. That's a little mind-bending. What does that mean exactly? And then I'll have a follow-up question. But I think it would be helpful if you just started to talk a little bit about like what it's like.
Okay. So yeah, my job as teaching fellow for your institute is absolutely the most important job I do. So acknowledged. And I think, summers in Pakistan or in Lahore or some parts of Pakistan, because Pakistan, as you may know, is one of the countries which obviously is at the receiving end of full climate calamity, as only having contributed less than 1% to the as a mitigate as an emission as an emitter. But so Pakistan is a longitudinal country, so we have all types of summers, right? From Skardu down to Lahore. But Lahore, for instance, and further south would be exceptionally hot. Okay, mostly arid, dry and hot. But what is interesting is that the summers in Pakistan and in Lahore and in other areas are also changing because they're becoming more and more unpredictable. For the agriculture, especially, which is basically where Punjab is, which is mostly the most arid, not the most arid, but the hottest, perhaps province, some parts of it, it's becoming exceptionally unpredictable. So I'm coming through 2 weeks of exceptional stormy weather every day, which is completely unknown to us in this time. I myself am an agriculturist also by background, and our mango crop this time is giving us half of what it gave us last time, because the heat did not come when it was supposed to. The cold went too long, and not the extreme temperatures that we used to. So more than how summers are, I think it's important for people to know how unpredictable everything has become.
So let me follow that up with, you should completely mistrust the statistic because it comes from my own research. But 95% of climate damages are projected to occur outside the OECD. And of course, Pakistan is near the very top of the list. And this is a question I've asked you before. I think I asked when you were a guest lecturer in my class, is how does should Pakistan be interested in conducting solar radiation management now? People's lives are being compromised. And, this is the real world panel. This isn't the research panel.
Okay, good. So this is a question that I did think about for today, right? And I think I come back to perhaps starting from the Climate Overshoot Commission, where I believe for other reasons, I was there because I was representing the South. I was also there because it helped for me to be gender woman, and it also helped, so I ticked all the boxes for Pascal. And then he found out I was more than just the boxes. Yeah. So...
Just for the record, we knew that from Chicago from the start.
Thank you. Okay, so interestingly, the fact about solar radiation modification, or whatever you call SRM, is that those who fear it most perhaps stand to benefit the most from it. So it is exceptionally important not to just discard that fear and say, "Oh, don't fear it. We will trust us." The trust has to be earned through historical facts and through behavior. Okay? And I will just put it over there for a moment and say, for me, coming to Pascal's lovely, by the way, I think the Climate Commission brought in the type of people that we needed. We had resources like David Keith who were available to guide us, etc. And then we had the political people and everyone else. And then, of course, Pascal as the captain of the ship. But it really brought us all to have to undo all the learnt behavior and fears that we had carried the weight of over the years of being part of a certain country, a certain bloc, a certain, a class of, I guess, academia or politics or wherever we are. So we were able to unburden them. Why were we able to unburden them? Because there was trust within the commission. And I would point out to David Keith as someone particularly who was able to point. He was not seen to be someone who was pushing SRM, but also pointing towards not the dangers, but all the sensitivities around it, right? And I remember in my first, in the first session we had on SRM, I compared SRM to the US going and invading Afghanistan and saying there were unintended consequences to everything that we think is going to do us great good. We look at SRM as that because we know that, yes, it will bring down the levels, this, that, the other. But what about the unintended consequences of putting all the aerosols in the clouds and at what proportion, etc.? So we reached a good sort of settlement. Going forward, David, Michael, I would really encourage that instead of looking at this as a problem that, oh, you guys really benefit from it, just follow it because we tell you to. Where the academia and the policy work and everything else is already sort of the proofed and baked and then presented. To try and not do that. Okay, to try and proof it and bake it with people who may be the best to benefit.
So I'll just point out, there's a satirical newspaper called The Onion. And one of my favorite headlines in The Onion is researchers call for more research. And now we have actual policymaker calls for more research. So that's terrific. Okay. Next, Justus. I understand you're very concerned about tipping points. I understand you're very concerned about something called AMOC. I wonder if you could, explain what AMOC is, and help us see how you see it with regard to tipping points and how all that relates to climate systems engineering.
Great. Yes, that's quite a tough one to actually explain what AMOC is to a scientific audience, being a non-scientist who actually...
Well, we have a wide group of people here. There's like the lowest of the low. There's some economists in the room. So
fair. Okay. So what AMOC essentially is, it's this kind of a conveyor belt that brings warm air and warm water in the Nordics, and then it turns back a bit below Greenland and then circles back to south. And if you think about where, for example, Finland and Iceland and rest of the Nordics stands on the globe, it's relatively warm there. I get this a lot actually when I travel. People ask, "Oh, is there polar bears in Finland or penguins?" And I'm like, no, like it's actually fairly warm in Finland, partly thanks to AMOC as well. So if you look at the same where, for example, northern parts of Canada are, it's a lot colder there. So thanks to this ocean current called AMOC, it keeps this northern parts of Scandinavia or Fenno-Scandinavia, because Finland is not actually part of Scandinavia, relatively warm. So the organization I work for is called Operaatio Arktis, and we haven't always worked on AMOC, but it has been one of these nonlinear climate risk, climate tipping points that has gained quite a lot of pace in last couple of years. And this is partly because last fall it was quite interesting that the Icelandic government framed the possible collapse of this ocean current as an issue for their national security. And not much has necessarily followed after this declaration, but what has followed is at least this issue has become quite widely discussed in the Nordic countries as well after this declaration. So AMOC is now on the agenda. We have been working more broadly on climate tipping points, but we have also seen that this has been quite a good timing and way to get the discussion on nonlinear climate risks and different future scenarios about climate on the table, and also keep climate on the agenda as well, because that has been a struggle as well. So this is one of the reasons as well. And there was a report that came from the Nordic Council of Ministers a couple of months ago on possible risks of AMOC collapse or even slowing down. And in that report, for example, they mentioned that researching some of these climate interventions like SRM could play a role in stabilizing some of these Earth systems.
And what would you like to see out of research on climate systems engineering? What are the great unresolved questions in your?
Does it work?
Does it work?
I mean, if you think about this category, we can speak about pumping water on top of the ice, or we can speak about adding sun reflecting mirrors into space and everything in between. So I think we always have to be very precise on what do we speak about when we speak about this topic. So I would like to see, of course, well, how could some of these approaches work in the specific context, but also how do things work in combination? Because I think real world is a real world, and as David said earlier, people had different agendas as well, and it might be a scenario that we are in the future where different people are trying to do different things at the same time. So that would be interesting to know as well. How do different things interact with each other?
I'm going to turn to Pascal next. And you've had many great experiences with multilateral governance. And when you hear some versions of SRM, it sounds like, well, just a single country could do it. It's not very expensive. We're just sitting around waiting for somebody to do it. That's obviously not what you think is the right outcome. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what would be the architecture of multilateral governance that you would recommend. And of course, we're always looking for good research ideas here at the university. So if you had suggestions on particular areas where more research would be fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key question, because in my view, and what has happened since we tabled this recommendation, effective investment in new science and adopting a moratorium, the kind of which we recommend, are intimately connected. Because the reality, and we haven't been discussing this morning, the reality, and I hope serious scientists will not disagree with me, is that investing in serious research at some stage will mean a test of deployment in real conditions. The whole part of that is about modeling and, testing lab, it's okay. I mean, nobody would disagree with that. The problem starts when you have to go real and test, for instance, the spread of aerosols in the stratosphere. And this is the key issue, because this is where the notion of risk starts dominating the conversation. Now, there's a good part of the conversation which is about risks, which is, and I refer to what Hina was saying, a number of people, well-intentioned, will believe SRM is too risky, and a number of people who have to live through the immediate damage of global warming will say, yeah, maybe you believe it's too risky, but my own risk, I can explain, it's not just a risk, it's happening. So this is a proper part of the conversation. And I think we really have to recognize it and, in a way, organize, feed, number this conversation, which is a political one. Then, and I'll get to your point, then comes the question of the governance with an inevitable, at this stage, north-south problem. And the problem comes from the fact that it's the North who's putting money, who's putting research. Whether you put China and India in the North and in the South is a geopolitical question, but there is a legitimate doubt or question by a large number of developing countries that if the money, the research, the doctrine is framed by the North, this is going to bring a northern bias in the result. And I think this is a fair question. Plus the fact, and let me be as diplomatic as possible, which is not my training, but with age it might help. If there is an issue with this northern bias, the fact that most of the investment on research is done in the US, at a period where, let's say, techno-optimism stemming from Silicon Valley and interpreted by a series of rows around the present president of the US might not help. Let me be very frank. This is a problem we did not have 2 or 3 years ago. In order to open a rational conversation, it's something we now have to be conscious of. This is an argument I did not hear 2 or 3 years ago, and which is I'm hearing now. Now, finishing on your question about governance, we need global governance on this, but my own view, for what it's worth, is that if we try to put in the hands of usual diplomats the parameters of what a proper governance of solar radiation modification in situ experiment would be, we are in for 25 years of negotiations. And we don't have 25 years ahead of us. And I go back, nor do I, by the way, probably, inshallah. So the issue is, and this is where we innovated in a way, let's not wait for a grand conference with a nice treaty architecture. Let's convince 5, 6, 7 states on this planet, and we have notions of who they might be, to together take this decision. And if they do that, then the others will have a problem. And this problem will be solved not by diplomats who have to agree on something, but by responsible politicians who will be asked, why don't you do that? And in our view, and there was a consensus in the Climate Overshoot Commission on that, this is a quicker, more pragmatic way to reaching conditions that allow very serious research, including in situ deployment, and a risk-adverse, let's say, precautionary attitude, which inevitably is part of the conversation. So, in order to get to global governance, our view is that there may be a shortcut, which is small global governance, small governance with a global intention that might trigger a dynamic which otherwise will never be there before too long.
Okay, I want to draw everyone else into this. This is super important points that you're making here. And you wandered into something that I plan to raise, which is, global governance is not my area, but I would say the response to COVID was not like a celebration of global governance. Many lives were lost for what could have been saved for very small amounts of money. The climate problem itself is a reflection of the challenges of global governance. I understood your reply. And then, of course, which I guess you were getting at, was the tech bros, which is terrific that they got entered into the conversation. And they're definitely in favor of some global governance of AI in about 13 years. And add to all that, I think later today, we're going to have the CEO of a startup who could actually just do the solar radiation management while we're all dithering around and doing our academic studies. So what is the path to governance? That's something I want to pose to the whole panel. It's not just your job. I will also add one other thing that is in your remarks. I agree a group of 5 or 6 would be great. But one thing that is super clear about climate change is how unequal the impacts of it are going to be, and how one would choose 5 or 6 that would reflect the wide variety of views that are going to be out there about, should we call it, the optimal global temperature. I'd like this group to chew on that, because it's something I can't sort out in my mind. Yeah.
Take a group of 7 middle-sized countries, no big shot, 4 from the south and 3 from the north.
That's a start. That's probably better than what the United States government thinks how it should be comprised. But anyway, Manish or Hina or Justus?
Happy, agree a lot. Pascal raised so many of the themes that are so important for this conversation. The importance of governance, the issue of equity and kind of the lack of equity in current conversations. But your push for us to break the problem into smaller parts and see how we can actually build that architecture is exactly right. And one of the things that NRDC is doing with a few other partners is actually, we just recently launched a solar geoengineering research governance platform with NGOs from different parts of the world to actually begin to develop governance for SRM research. So just taking a small piece of the problem, looking at research, getting a representative group of civil society actors to at least to begin to sketch out what that should look like. And I think that's a part of, we're going to have to do this kind of variable geometry of different ways of trying to build those types of guardrails. But I think that's going to be that's going to be the way in which I think we're going to get to something that the world would agree in terms of how we actually move forward on this set of issues.
Yeah, so this is so very, very complex, and it doesn't help as to where we are vis-a-vis the world. Okay, because I think if you look at global governance structures, I would just like to say that I don't think it's the UN has failed. It's the countries which are supposed to be major players within the UN, hold veto, and the other players who have perhaps failed the UN rather than the other way around. Just trying to make the point that the world is not the type of place where you're going to have nuclear security, architecture made, even though it was the Cold War, we were able to do that. And at this time, with its AI or its lethal autonomous weapons of war or any of those dangerous, and climate change itself, the very architect of souvenirs sitting over here, the policeman of the world in terms of common goods used to be the US, and the US has been in and out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is what it was. So we're living in a world which is not really prone to governing or to be looking out for what are the common goods, what are the failures, what is the architecture that is required. Now, in a world like that, let's be clear. Okay, so my view is, and I might be biased because I come from the other world. I don't think the civil society is going to cut it in terms of creating the small or big architecture about this. Okay, there is this thing called nation states, and there is this thing called borders. The stratosphere has no borders. So if I decide to deploy SRM in one form or the other today in Pakistan, Delhi and Lahore are a few kilometers away. Okay, so what I'll take the decision, but the consequences would also be felt in India or anywhere else. I mean, in the same way. Therefore, to try and manage this completely in a way that, look, we know what to do, it is the best, and we will go ahead and do it, maybe actually um, bringing it to never the type of fruition that you would actually want. So it's a bit of a therefore I think what we reached in the Paris not in the commission was really a very good sort of point of what is it that you want to achieve. You want to achieve absolute confidence through doing absolute and intensive research, but put a moratorium on large scale deployment in order to engineer some trust from people that they're not pushing it down their throat, right? But the research, even on the governance and on what are going to be the possible intended and unintended consequences on putting this into the atmosphere, is exceptionally important. So when we reach the point, Michael, whether you and I agree, I think science tells us as to what is the tipping point in terms of global warming, right? And by the way, I do want to point out over here, I think living in America, at least most of you probably don't realize that the rest of the world is not filled with climate deniers as much as this country is. I mean, the rest of the world is rather more logical and does look at science and does look at research seriously and does take people like David Keith and the research and their work seriously still. I mean, it might be almost like alien here, but it is still looking at what science says, yeah? So I think it's exceptionally important to be aware of the challenges, to be aware of the dangers, to be aware of the pitfalls, but yes, not to say that you're not going to wait for a consensus agreement on this, right? But it will help if you're able to engineer, sort of gather more trust by having research which is trustable, which has a wider variety of people which are behind it. And I think that's why, in some ways, what is happening over here is the cutting edge of what is required to be done.
Justus, would you want to explain the global governance structure that's going to protect Finland's much beloved AMOC?
I could give you from an NGO led by youth in Finland how they see a global governance, likely a really, really romanticized view of their role. But I think if you want to stay more practical, I would like to go and take this time to not to necessarily look at the global governance structure as whole, but maybe break it down a bit and pay also attention to public leadership and the role of small NGOs and civil society organizations and what kind of role they can play. And I think this topic or what could be helpful is that this topic has been quite hard to touch for many civil society organizations and NGOs, and I think it would be really helpful if more of civil society organizations, NGOs working in climate would be able to attend this discussion, because those are the people who actually can ask the really relevant questions in the local context. And I think those are then the ones that can easily guide us for research questions, but also through that to governance principles. For example, I was in Kenya last year. I was in Nairobi and I met a group of young people who are based in a local slum. They had their own climate organization, and they were actually quite interested of SRM, but from a perspective of how would any kind of deployment of SRM affect their lives in that area. And I think if we enable these kind of people or anybody to understand and ask questions that are locally relevant, it can help to also form governance principles. Because you know what, whatever we decide to do or not to do in the atmosphere or in the Arctic or Antarctic, I think it's how it plays down in the life of ordinary people that in the end matters.
Thanks. So we're going to play a little game now, which is This is the first annual Frontiers in Climate Systems Engineering. In 2031, there will be the 6th annual one. I have no doubt that President Alvasados will give opening remarks. David will follow them. And when there's a policy panel or a real world panel like this one, what presumably, and all of you have performed admirably, and I issue an invitation for 5 years from now to return, what will you be discussing? What will have changed?
So, what I wish to happen by then is two things. First, a lot of money will have gone into serious research about geoengineering, SRM being, for the reasons we heard already this morning, in my view, the most promising one, let's say, short term. A lot of money will have gone into serious research in a way that allows the necessary transparency, sharing of this research. So it has to be an open research, the results of which are shared like open source. And this, in my view, is a fundamental condition for moving forward. And the second thing I wish to happen is that we by then we'll have this small coalition of 7 middle-sized states, which will have succeeded in agreeing at this small scale on the conditions under which you exit the moratorium. And mind you, this is tricky. We've started entering into that with a few extremely talented lawyers. That's not easy. So those are the two things I wish by them will have happened.
Manish?
Yeah, just to build on that, thinking a little bit about 2029, and two responses. One, kind of what may happen in the United States. One, what we might like to see globally. In the United States, there's a lot of work starting now about how do we reimagine climate and energy policy federally post-28 elections. And in that context, recognizing that, how we talk about climate, how we connect it to where people are, how we connect it to the affordability, the cost, the jobs issues becomes incredibly important. And in that context, there's going to be some work that we're going to need to do to help make sure that both CDR and SRM get a spot in what that climate policy agenda for 2029 would actually look like. It should not be taken as a foregone conclusion that in Washington that there is a lot of appetite for this type of work. So how we both ensure that there is a recognition about the importance of the demand-side signal for CDR and for research money for SRM, that's going to take some real work. And I think globally, what would be great to see is that the economics are shifting quickly on, clean energy, on climate action, but how we get countries to begin to recognize the need for carbon removal and the need to actually engage in research on SRM, whereby it isn't all kind of based out of the US or based out of the global north, but there is kind of credibility and work being done in those countries where we can actually have a much more in-depth conversation about what the governance structure, not only for research, but potential experimentation or deployment would need to look like.
So can I pick one that there's one thing I've really was struck by in beginning maybe 5 years ago, lots of interest in voluntary carbon reductions. Economists are very skeptical of voluntary. People like to spend money on things they like. But that really seemed to take hold, and there were all these promises of net zero of 2050. And at the end, CDR is going to require a buyer. And so now we're in the 2031 6th annual conference, and you're back. Where did those buyers come from?
I think we need to see actually mandatory climate regulations. I am so the
Okay,
the
so
vol-
I'm going to make it go slow
so
there.
because-
Who's imposing mandatory climate regulations?
I think you need actual policy.
The United States of America, or
States,
yeah,
or federally, because I think the challenge. Remember, when you do the VCM, when you do the voluntary markets, you need companies in order to get credit for CDR to go beyond what their Paris-aligned targets should be. Right, so that is a pretty hard order to ask them. They have to look at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, be able to actually tackle those, and then be willing to purchase more to make the math actually add up. And so the expectation that the voluntary markets would lead to credible reductions in carbon removal that make the math, that's a big ask. And that's why I actually think we need to find ways to get mandatory climate legislation that actually is going to provide the demand signal for these types of investments.
Hina, did you want to join in?
Yeah. So I mean, the good part about having a panel like this is we all come from our own worlds, right, and our own perspectives. And I think what you asked for was not what do we wish to be happening in 5 years, but what do we think would be happening, right? And I think I'm just going to raise one really big what if scenario, which is going to change tremendously, is that if we continue to venture into wars of choices portrayed as wars of necessity, I don't think we are going to be able to see a global architecture or global convergence on any of the issues which are actually not only harming but are a big danger to our lives in many parts of the world. Okay, because there is this whole question of somebody wanting to put their energy and their domestic political capital into things like climate change. Currently, that is not happening. I would also point out that if we are able to move away from looking at China only as a possible threat and trying to only deal with it, in the ways we have in the last 10 years, not only the US, also most parts of Europe, then again, I think the architecture or the coming of normalization of deployment of such things, such as SRM at a global stage, at a stage where one is not trying to do it at the cost of another, will probably not be very likely. However, if you're able to move over that hump and look at China, which was perhaps not the largest emitter, we all know who it was till 2000, it was largely the US and European Union, etc. But now is increasingly becoming larger and larger emitter, which is also contributing a lot on EV production and on, cleaning it up, etc. So this is, I will once again say, unfortunately, not going to be a bottom-up approach. It will have to be a bit of top-down approach because nation states will be important in the deployment of SRM, no matter what you say, no matter whether there's buy-in or not. And I agree with what Pascal personally thinks and what is also in the commission, that you will need one or two countries, perhaps, to be able to show, confidence in it, right? Now, the problem again comes to that the biggest beneficiaries are the ones that fare it the most because the research is not happening over there. There's no awareness. It is only something that you fare. Let me share with you, Michael and everyone. I mean, it's interesting because when I raise this with people who work with me, diplomats, their first reaction is, "Oh, madam, please stay away." Okay? I mean, literally, that is their first reaction because and you can't blame them because they haven't learned to trust a lot in climate negotiations. I mean, loss and damage fund came after the 2022 floods of Pakistan and it was long in the making for 40 years and even now. So I'm not going to go into the history of all of that, but all I'm saying is this is an area which could really use a lot of trust. On SRM, I would be very, very, very careful on not doing anything which actually takes us away from the world and the path of trust and rather than towards it.
Okay, so let me push on that. I hear you loud and clear. How does one build trust in practice?
Okay, one builds trust in practice by trying to invest as much as we can in the research rather than the large-scale deployment and to share that research, as Pascal also said, openly and widely. As I said, genuinely, I don't mean this as a joke, people do believe in science in most of the other parts of the world. And science which is credible is important. Okay, so science which will be credible will be important. It will be used as a guiding force, guiding principle, and buying in other countries from whether you call it the Southern Bloc or the developing country, whatever nomenclature you use, will be important.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to do a quiz. Curious, I'm going to give you 2 numbers and you're going to say above or below. The first number, currently the world is doing about 50 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year. I want to know if we're going to be, when we're like here again in 2031, above or below.
Absolutely below.
Absolutely below.
Same.
Below the current number, you're saying?
Yes. CO2
Above.
emissions.
Above.
Above.
Slightly below.
That the slightly is going to be edited out. So
fair. It's easy with AI nowadays. You can
Yeah.
literally say whatever.
Okay, I will not share my own view. Carbon dioxide removal. In 2031, will we be doing 1 billion tons per year? Oh, no, don't look at the frontier woman.
No.
Sorry. Let me rephrase it now that she spoiled the question. What year will we be doing 1 billion tons of CO2 of carbon dioxide removal?
2040.
40.
50.
Never.
I have to go with the mid-century as well.
Okay, excellent. Please join me in thanking this awesome panel.